December 22nd, 1989. A frantic helicopter lifts off from the roof of the Romanian Communist Party headquarters in Bucharest. Inside, a man who had ruled Romania with absolute power for over 2 decades clutches desperately at the seat as the aircraft carries him away from crowds of his own people baying for his blood. Just 4 days later, that same man would face a firing squad, his body riddled with bullets in a school classroom turned makeshift courtroom. But the story of Nicolae Ceaușescu's final moments pales in comparison to the systematic horror he inflicted on an entire nation for 24 years. This is the story of a dictator whose paranoia transformed Romania into a surveillance state where children informed on their parents, where doctors were forced to examine women monthly to ensure they were producing enough babies for the state, and where an entire population was starved while their leader lived in unimaginable luxury. The depths of cruelty that Ceaușescu would sink to in his quest for absolute control would shock even hardened observers of totalitarian regimes. Nicolae Ceaușescu's path to power began in the most unremarkable circumstances imaginable. Born in 1918 in the small village of Scornicești, he was the third of 10 children in a peasant family struggling to survive in rural Romania. His early years were marked by poverty and hardship that would later shape his paranoid worldview and insatiable hunger for power. At just 11 years old, Ceaușescu left his village to work as a shoemaker's apprentice in Bucharest. The young boy was quickly drawn to communist ideology, joining the Union of Communist Youth at age 14. His commitment to the cause was absolute, and by 16, he had already served his first prison sentence for anti-government activities. Prison became Ceaușescu's university. During multiple incarcerations throughout the 1930s, he studied Marxist theory and formed relationships with other communist activists who would later become his allies in seizing power. Most importantly, he caught the attention of Gheorghe Dej, the man who would eventually become Romania's communist leader. When the Red Army entered Romania in 1944, Ceaușescu was ready. At just 26 years old, he was appointed Secretary of the Union of Communist Youth, giving him control over the indoctrination of Romania's next generation. His rise through the party hierarchy was meteoric, driven by a combination of ruthless ambition and complete loyalty to Gheorghe Dej. The death of Gheorghe Dej in 1965 created a power vacuum that Ceaușescu was perfectly positioned to fill. Through careful manipulation and backroom dealing, he emerged as the new General Secretary of the Romanian Communist Party. At 47, he had achieved the ultimate prize: absolute power over 20 million Romanians. Initially, Ceaușescu's rule appeared to offer hope for Romania's future. He pursued a foreign policy independent of Moscow, criticizing the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 and establishing diplomatic relations with Western nations. This defiance of Soviet authority earned him praise in the West and made him appear to be a reformist leader. But beneath the surface, Ceaușescu was already laying the groundwork for a reign of terror that would surpass even Stalin's Soviet Union in its systematic cruelty and paranoid control over every aspect of human life. The first signs of what was to come emerged in his domestic policies. Ceaușescu began centralizing power in his own hands, eliminating potential rivals within the party, and establishing a cult of personality that would eventually reach absurd proportions. He appointed family members to key positions, creating a dynasty that would control every aspect of Romanian society. His wife, Elena, a woman with minimal education who had worked as a laboratory assistant, was elevated to become the second most powerful person in Romania. Despite having no scientific background, she was awarded a doctorate in chemistry and given positions in the Academy of Sciences. This nepotism was just the beginning of a systematic corruption that would hollow out Romanian institutions. By 1967, Ceaușescu had consolidated enough power to begin implementing his vision of a perfect socialist society. What followed would be 22 years of increasingly brutal experimentation on the Romanian people, as their leader pursued policies so extreme that they defied human comprehension. But the true darkness was only just beginning to emerge, and the Romanian people had no idea of the horrors that awaited them under their new conductor. The Romania that Nicolae Ceaușescu began constructing in the late 1960s was designed to be the most perfectly controlled society in human history. Every citizen would be monitored, every conversation recorded, and every thought scrutinized by an ever-watching state apparatus that penetrated into the most intimate corners of private life. The instrument of this total control was the Securitate, Romania's secret police force that would eventually employ over 11,000 full-time officers and command a network of nearly 500,000 informants. Under Ceaușescu's direction, the Securitate became more than just a security service. It became the nervous system of a paranoid state that viewed every citizen as a potential enemy. The recruitment of informants began in childhood. Teachers were required to identify students who showed signs of disloyalty to the regime, while students were encouraged to report on their classmates and even their own parents. Children as young as 8 years old were approached by Securitate officers and offered small privileges in exchange for information about their family's private conversations. The Radu family from Cluj discovered the extent of this system when their 12-year-old son reported his father's criticism of food shortages to his teacher. Within days, Securitate agents arrived at their home for a friendly conversation that lasted 6 hours. The father spent the next 3 months in detention, while his son was praised at school as a model communist youth. Workplace surveillance was equally pervasive. Every factory, office, and institution had its complement of informants who reported on their colleagues' productivity, political attitudes, and personal relationships. The Securitate maintained detailed files on millions of Romanians, documenting everything from their sexual behavior to their private jokes about the regime. The paranoia extended to every level of society. Ceaușescu trusted no one completely, not even his closest allies. Government ministers discovered that their own bodyguards were reporting their private conversations to the Securitate. Party officials found that their secretaries, drivers, and even their cooks were filing detailed reports about their daily activities. The psychological impact of this constant surveillance was devastating. Romanians learned to speak in whispers even in their own homes, never knowing who might be listening. Husbands and wives became suspicious of each other. Parents feared their own children, and friendships withered under the weight of mutual distrust. The Securitate's methods of gathering information were as creative as they were intrusive. Apartments were bugged with sophisticated listening devices, while hidden cameras recorded intimate moments that could later be used for blackmail. Mail was routinely opened and read, telephone conversations were monitored, and even confession booths in churches were equipped with recording equipment. Religious believers faced particular scrutiny under this system. The Orthodox Church, while officially tolerated, was thoroughly penetrated by Securitate informants. Priests were forced to report the contents of confessions, while church services were monitored for signs of political dissent. Those who attended religious services regularly found themselves subjected to harassment at work and exclusion from educational opportunities. The regime's paranoia reached absurd heights when it came to foreign influences. Romanians caught listening to Western radio broadcasts faced imprisonment, while possession of foreign books or magazines was treated as evidence of espionage. Even learning foreign languages without official permission was considered suspicious behavior that warranted investigation. But the surveillance state was only the foundation for even more horrific policies that would turn Romania into a laboratory for the most extreme forms of social engineering ever attempted by a modern government. The true nightmare was yet to come, as Ceaușescu prepared to implement policies that would control not just what Romanians thought and said, but their very bodies and reproductive choices. In 1966, Nicolae Ceaușescu made a decision that would cause more human suffering than any other policy of his regime. Obsessed with increasing Romania's population to create a more powerful workforce and military, he issued Decree 770, banning contraception and abortion, while offering financial incentives for large families. The immediate consequences were catastrophic. Romania's birth rate doubled almost overnight, but the state was completely unprepared for the surge in births. Hospitals lacked adequate facilities, medical supplies ran short, and trained staff were overwhelmed by the sudden demand for obstetric care. Women who had previously been able to plan their families found themselves trapped in a system that treated them as breeding machines for the state. Those who attempted to circumvent the law faced severe punishment, while doctors who performed illegal procedures risked long prison sentences. The underground abortion market that developed was both dangerous and expensive. Desperate women turned to back-alley practitioners who operated in unsanitary conditions with crude instruments. The mortality rate from illegal procedures soared, but the regime showed no concern for these deaths, viewing them as acceptable casualties in the pursuit of demographic goals. Dr. Maria Popescu, a gynecologist in Bucharest, later described the horror of this period. Women would arrive at emergency rooms bleeding and infected from botched procedures, begging for help but afraid to explain what had happened. Many died from complications that could have been easily prevented under normal circumstances. The regime established a system of mandatory monthly gynecological examinations for all women of childbearing age. These examinations were designed to identify pregnancies early and ensure that women carried their babies to term. Women who missed appointments were tracked down by authorities, while those who suffered miscarriages were subjected to investigations to determine whether they had attempted to terminate their pregnancies. The psychological trauma inflicted by these policies was immense. Women lived in constant fear of becoming pregnant, knowing that they would have no choice but to carry any pregnancy to term, regardless of their circumstances. Many couples stopped having intimate relations entirely, while others lived in constant anxiety about the possibility of conception. The children born as a result of Decree 770 became known as Ceaușescu's children. Many came from families that could not afford to feed or care for them properly, leading to widespread abandonment. Romania's orphanages became overcrowded warehouses for unwanted children, many of whom suffered from malnutrition, disease, and severe developmental problems. The conditions in these state-run institutions were appalling. Children were housed in large dormitory rooms with minimal supervision, inadequate food, and virtually no medical care. Many suffered from preventable diseases, while others showed signs of severe psychological trauma from the institutional environment. International observers who gained access to Romanian orphanages in later years described scenes that defied human comprehension. Children tied to beds for days at a time, babies who had never been held or spoken to, and adolescents who had spent their entire lives in institutions without ever experiencing normal human relationships. The regime's response to the orphanage crisis was to hide the problem rather than address it. Foreign visitors were shown model institutions, while the worst facilities were kept secret. Romanian media was forbidden to report on the conditions, and those who attempted to publicize the situation faced imprisonment. But the demographic disaster was only one aspect of Ceaușescu's war against his own people. His obsession with transforming Romanian society would soon manifest in even more extreme policies that would reshape the very landscape of the country. The destruction of Romania's rural communities was about to begin, as Ceaușescu prepared to implement a plan that would eliminate thousands of villages and force millions of people from their ancestral homes. In 1974, Nicolae Ceaușescu announced what he called the systematization of Romania, a grandiose plan to demolish thousands of rural villages and relocate their populations to newly constructed urban centers. This policy, which would ultimately affect nearly half of Romania's villages, represented one of the most ambitious and destructive social engineering projects of the 20th century. The official justification for systematization was economic modernization. Ceaușescu claimed that concentrating the rural population in larger settlements would improve agricultural efficiency and provide better access to modern amenities. But the true motivation was political control. Scattered rural communities were difficult to monitor and control, while concentrated populations could be more easily surveilled and indoctrinated. The systematization program began with the creation of detailed maps identifying villages marked for destruction. Teams of surveyors and planners descended on rural communities, measuring buildings and cataloging assets without explanation. Villagers watched in confusion and growing fear as officials marked their homes and churches for demolition. The first villages to be destroyed were those deemed economically unviable or politically unreliable. Residents were given minimal notice to evacuate their homes, often just days or weeks, to abandon everything their families had built over generations. Personal belongings that could not be transported were simply destroyed along with the buildings. The Georga family from the village of Magura in Brașov County experienced the full horror of systematization. They had lived in their ancestral home for 4 generations, maintaining a small farm and caring for elderly relatives. When officials arrived with bulldozers, they were given 48 hours to evacuate. The family's livestock was slaughtered, their fruit trees were cut down, and their home was reduced to rubble. Entire communities that had existed for centuries were wiped from the map in a matter of days. Churches that had served as spiritual centers for rural communities were demolished without regard for their historical or cultural significance. Ancient graveyards were plowed under, obliterating the final resting places of countless generations. The human cost of systematization was devastating. Elderly villagers who had never lived anywhere else died shortly after relocation, unable to adapt to unfamiliar urban environments. Children lost their connection to rural traditions and ways of life that had sustained Romanian culture for centuries. The new urban centers that replaced the destroyed villages were architectural nightmares. Hastily constructed apartment blocks provided minimal living space and virtually no privacy. Families that had owned their homes and land for generations found themselves crowded into tiny apartments with thin walls and no outdoor space. The agricultural impact was equally disastrous. The destruction of villages often meant the abandonment of carefully maintained farmland that had been cultivated for centuries. Traditional farming knowledge was lost as communities were scattered, while the new collective agricultural system proved far less efficient than the private plots it replaced. Cultural destruction was perhaps the most tragic aspect of systematization. Romania's rural villages had preserved ancient customs, folk traditions, and dialects that represented the authentic soul of the nation. The demolition of these communities meant the irretrievable loss of cultural heritage that had survived centuries of foreign occupation and political upheaval. The resistance to systematization was largely passive but widespread. Villagers hid valuable objects and family heirlooms, hoping to preserve some connection to their lost heritage. Some families refused to relocate, camping in the ruins of their destroyed homes until authorities forcibly removed them. The program also targeted ethnic minorities with particular severity. Hungarian and German villages were disproportionately selected for destruction, as Ceaușescu pursued a policy of cultural homogenization alongside geographic reorganization. These communities lost not only their homes, but also their schools, churches, and cultural centers. International condemnation of systematization was swift and severe, but Ceaușescu dismissed foreign criticism as interference in Romania's internal affairs. He accelerated the program in response to international pressure, determined to complete his transformation of Romanian society before external forces could intervene. By the mid-1980s, over 4,000 villages had been destroyed, with plans for the elimination of thousands more. The social fabric of rural Romania lay in ruins, replaced by sterile urban centers that bore no connection to the country's history or culture. But even as Ceaușescu was destroying Romania's villages, he was simultaneously constructing monuments to his own ego that would consume vast resources while his people starved. While ordinary Romanians struggled to find basic necessities like bread and heating fuel, Nicolae Ceaușescu embarked on the construction of what would become the second largest administrative building in the world, the Palace of the Parliament. This monument to his own ego would consume enormous resources and reshape the heart of Bucharest, while serving as the ultimate symbol of his detachment from reality. Construction began in 1984 with the demolition of an entire historic district of Bucharest. Over 7,000 homes, 30 churches, 3 monasteries, 2 temples, and numerous hospitals and schools were destroyed to make room for Ceaușescu's vision. Approximately 40,000 people were forced from their homes with minimal compensation, their neighborhoods erased to satisfy the dictator's architectural ambitions. The scale of the project was staggering. The palace would contain over 1,100 rooms, spread across 365,000 square meters of floor space. The building's footprint covered 65,000 square meters, making it larger than the Pentagon, and exceeded in size only by the Aalsmeer flower auction building in the Netherlands. Every aspect of the palace's construction had to meet Ceaușescu's exacting and often bizarre specifications. He personally approved every detail, from the color of marble used in the floors to the precise height of each chandelier. The building materials had to be exclusively Romanian, leading to the development of entire industries devoted solely to supplying the palace project. The marble came from quarries in Rușița, where workers labored under dangerous conditions to extract the perfect stones. The crystal for the chandeliers was produced in factories that operated around the clock, while skilled craftsmen worked exclusively on decorative elements for the palace. The cost of these materials alone exceeded the annual budget of most Romanian government ministries. Over 100,000 workers were employed on the project at its peak, working in shifts around the clock to meet Ceaușescu's impossible deadlines. Many of these workers were conscripted from other essential projects, leaving hospitals, schools, and infrastructure improvements incomplete while resources poured into the palace. The working conditions were harsh and dangerous. Construction workers operated heavy machinery in poorly lit conditions, while safety regulations were ignored in the rush to complete the project. Accidents were common, but the regime suppressed information about injuries and fatalities to avoid negative publicity about the beloved palace project. Ceaușescu's personal involvement in the construction bordered on the obsessive. He conducted weekly inspections of the work, often demanding changes that required tearing down completed sections. Walls were rebuilt multiple times to achieve his exact vision, while rooms were redesigned according to his changing whims. The palace's interior design reflected Ceaușescu's grandiose self-image and complete lack of aesthetic judgment. Enormous halls were decorated with oversized furniture and massive chandeliers that would have been more appropriate for a Hollywood movie set than a government building. Gold leaf was applied liberally to surfaces, creating a gaudy display of wealth in a country where most citizens could not afford adequate food. The throne room, designed for state receptions, featured a ceiling over 16 meters high and walls decorated with silk tapestries depicting Romania's history. The carpet, woven specifically for the room, weighed over 14 tons and required a specially reinforced floor to support its weight. The palace also included a nuclear bunker capable of surviving a direct atomic attack. This underground complex contained its own power generation facilities, water supplies, and air filtration systems. The bunker was connected to other government buildings through a network of tunnels that would allow Ceaușescu to maintain control even during a nuclear war. While the palace consumed vast resources, ordinary Romanians were subjected to increasingly severe austerity measures. Electricity was rationed to just 2 hours per day in most homes, while heating was limited to a few hours during the coldest winter months. Food shortages became chronic, with basic items like meat, milk, and bread available only through long queues and rationing systems. The contrast between the palace's opulence and the population's suffering was stark and intentional. Ceaușescu wanted his subjects to understand the vast gulf between his power and their powerlessness. The palace served as a daily reminder of the dictator's absolute control over the country's resources and priorities. Construction workers on the palace project were forced to sign secrecy agreements and were forbidden from discussing their work with family members. Those who violated these agreements faced imprisonment, while their families were subjected to increased surveillance and harassment. But even as Ceaușescu poured Romania's wealth into his architectural fantasies, he was implementing economic policies that would bring the country to the brink of starvation and social collapse. By the early 1980s, Nicolae Ceaușescu had made a decision that would push Romania to the edge of humanitarian catastrophe. Obsessed with paying off the country's foreign debt ahead of schedule, he ordered the export of virtually all Romanian agricultural and industrial production, leaving his own people to survive on subsistence rations that would have been insufficient in medieval times. The policy, grandly announced as achieving full economic independence, was in reality a systematic starvation of the Romanian population to satisfy Ceaușescu's megalomaniacal pride. Rather than negotiating reasonable payment schedules with international creditors, he chose to impoverish his entire nation to eliminate foreign debt by 1989. Food rationing was introduced gradually, with initial restrictions on meat and dairy products that were explained as temporary measures. But the rationing system quickly expanded to cover virtually every consumable item. Bread, the most basic staple of the Romanian diet, was limited to just 300 grams per person per day. Meat was rationed to 500 grams per month, when it was available at all. The queuing system that developed around food distribution became a central feature of Romanian life. Citizens would begin lining up before dawn for the chance to purchase their rationed allowances, often waiting for hours, only to discover that supplies had run out. The lucky few who obtained their rations would then face the challenge of creating edible meals from ingredients of steadily declining quality. Milk became so scarce that it was only available for pregnant women, nursing mothers, and children under 2 years old. Even then, supplies were erratic, and many infants suffered from malnutrition due to inadequate nutrition. Cooking oil, sugar, and coffee disappeared from stores entirely for months at a time, while eggs became luxury items that most families could obtain only occasionally. The regime's response to food shortages was to blame saboteurs and foreign enemies, rather than acknowledge the obvious consequences of its export policies. Propaganda campaigns urged citizens to make do with less, while celebrating Romania's agricultural exports as patriotic achievements. The suffering of ordinary people was reframed as noble sacrifice for the greater glory of the socialist fatherland. Restaurants and cafeterias were forced to operate with severely restricted menus that bore no resemblance to traditional Romanian cuisine. A typical restaurant meal might consist of a thin soup made from potato peels and a small portion of bread. Many establishments simply closed rather than attempt to operate under these impossible conditions. The black market that emerged to circumvent rationing was both dangerous and expensive. Those caught trading in illegal food faced severe punishment, while the prices demanded for basic items were beyond the reach of most Romanian families. A kilogram of meat could cost a month's wages, while luxury items like chocolate or real coffee commanded astronomical prices. Rural families, who had traditionally been more self-sufficient, found their private plots and livestock confiscated to meet export quotas. Peasants who had grown their own food for generations were forced to turn over their harvests to state collection centers, leaving them dependent on the same inadequate rationing system as urban dwellers. The health consequences of chronic malnutrition became apparent throughout Romanian society. Children showed signs of stunted growth and developmental delays, while adults suffered from various deficiency diseases. Hospital admissions for malnutrition-related conditions increased dramatically, but the regime suppressed statistics to maintain the fiction of socialist prosperity. Teachers reported that students frequently fainted from hunger during classes, while factory workers struggled to maintain productivity on inadequate nutrition. The birth rate declined as malnourished women experienced increased rates of miscarriage and infertility, creating a cruel irony given Ceaușescu's obsession with population growth. Heating fuel was also subject to severe rationing, with most homes receiving only enough to heat one room for a few hours each day during winter. Families huddled together in single rooms, wearing multiple layers of clothing to survive temperatures that often dropped below freezing indoors. The elderly suffered disproportionately under these conditions. Many lacked the physical strength to stand in long queues for food, while their fixed incomes made black market purchases impossible. Nursing homes became warehouses for the slowly dying, as inadequate nutrition and heating claimed thousands of elderly lives each winter. Medical care deteriorated as hospitals lacked basic supplies and equipment. Doctors struggled to treat patients without adequate medications or diagnostic tools, while medical procedures were postponed indefinitely due to shortages of essential materials. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of the starvation policy was its complete arbitrariness. Romania was capable of feeding its population adequately, but Ceaușescu chose not to do so in service of his delusional economic goals. The suffering was entirely preventable, making it a form of state-sponsored torture inflicted on an entire population. As the 1980s progressed and conditions continued to deteriorate, even the most loyal Communist Party members began to question the sustainability of Ceaușescu's policies. The foundations of his regime were beginning to crack under the weight of accumulated suffering and systematic oppression. Nicolae Ceaușescu's transformation from Communist Party leader to quasi-divine ruler was one of the most extreme examples of personality cult development in modern history. By the 1980s, the Romanian dictator had constructed an elaborate mythology around himself and his family that rivaled the imperial cults of ancient Rome in its absurdity and exceeded them in its invasive presence in daily life. The cult began with relatively modest propaganda efforts in the late 1960s, but gradually expanded until virtually every aspect of Romanian culture and society was subordinated to the glorification of Ceaușescu and his achievements. No publication could appear without multiple references to the conductor's wisdom. No public event could proceed without lengthy tributes to his leadership, and no Romanian could escape constant exposure to his image and ideology. Elena Ceaușescu was elevated to goddess-like status as the mother of the nation and the most brilliant scientist of our time. Despite her minimal education and complete lack of scientific training, she was awarded honorary doctorates from universities around the world and published numerous scientific papers that were actually written by teams of ghostwriters. Romanian children were taught to revere her as a maternal figure who watched over their welfare with divine concern. The couple's children were similarly mythologized, with their son Nicu presented as a brilliant young leader, destined to continue the Ceaușescu dynasty. His academic achievements were fabricated, his character flaws were hidden from public view, and his future succession was treated as inevitable. The entire family became untouchable figures whose actions could not be questioned or criticized. Public demonstrations of loyalty became increasingly elaborate and absurd. Massive rallies were organized where hundreds of thousands of citizens were forced to attend and cheer for hours, while Ceaușescu delivered rambling speeches about his achievements. These events were carefully choreographed to create the impression of spontaneous popular enthusiasm, but participants faced punishment if they failed to show appropriate enthusiasm. The regime produced an endless stream of books, films, and songs celebrating Ceaușescu's greatness. Libraries were required to maintain entire sections devoted to works by and about the conductor, while bookstores displayed his writings prominently. Children's books portrayed him as a wise and benevolent leader who loved all Romanian children, while adult literature praised his genius in solving complex political and economic problems. Romanian television programming was dominated by coverage of Ceaușescu's activities. News broadcasts consisted largely of reports on his meetings with foreign dignitaries, his visits to Romanian factories and farms, and lengthy excerpts from his speeches. Entertainment programming was minimal, with most airtime devoted to documentaries about the leader's achievements and the success of Romanian socialism under his guidance. The visual propaganda surrounding Ceaușescu was omnipresent and inescapable. His portrait hung in every office, classroom, and public building in Romania. Streets, squares, and institutions were renamed in his honor, while statues and monuments depicting the conductor appeared in city centers throughout the country. No Romanian could move through public space without encountering multiple images of their leader. The language used to describe Ceaușescu became increasingly extravagant and religious in tone. Official publications referred to him as the genius of the Carpathians, the most beloved son of the Romanian people, and the brilliant architect of Romania's future. His wife was described as the shining star of Romanian science and the caring mother of all Romanian children. Ceaușescu's personality cult permeated every layer of Romanian life. Universities established fields like Ceaușescu Thought, with students required to praise his ideology in coursework, while academics competed to show loyalty through exaggerated tributes to his supposed genius. Private life was equally controlled. Weddings included oaths to the conductor, children were blessed in his name, and portraits of him adorned homes. Religious institutions were co-opted, with priests praying publicly for his health and religious holidays recast to celebrate his role as the guardian of Romanian values. The cult grew increasingly absurd. Ceaușescu was credited with fictitious breakthroughs in science, and scholars were forced to cite his work in research. Even weather reports and sports victories were attributed to his leadership, turning routine broadcasts into propaganda tools. Yet, behind this carefully crafted illusion, public frustration mounted. The chasm between state propaganda and everyday hardship had become impossible to ignore. Despite pervasive surveillance, resentment spread, and the foundations of the regime were beginning to crack. By December 1989, Romanians had endured over 2 decades of worsening repression, shortages, and fear under Nicolae Ceaușescu's regime. The spark for revolution came from the city of Timișoara, where Hungarian Reformed pastor Laszlo Tokes resisted government pressure to stop speaking out. When authorities tried to relocate him, his congregation formed a human shield around his church. Their peaceful protest quickly grew. On December 16th, demonstrations erupted in Timișoara, with thousands demanding an end to the dictatorship. Ceaușescu responded with brutal force. Soldiers opened fire on civilians, killing and wounding many. Instead of ending the uprising, the violence ignited it. News of the massacre spread across Romania through foreign radio, inspiring protests in other cities. Ceaușescu dismissed the unrest as foreign interference, unwilling to admit the people had turned against him. But on December 21st, a state-orchestrated rally in Bucharest backfired. As Ceaușescu addressed the crowd, they began booing and chanting anti-regime slogans, live on national television. His stunned reaction exposed his weakening grip on power. That same day, protests spread across the capital. Some military units began siding with demonstrators, refusing orders to fire on civilians. The regime's control was unraveling. On December 22nd, as protesters surrounded the Communist Party headquarters, Ceaușescu appeared one last time on the balcony, delivering a desperate, disconnected speech. The crowd responded with jeers. He and his wife, Elena, fled by helicopter. But it was too late. After 24 years, the Ceaușescu era was collapsing. Justice was coming. The helicopter carrying Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu from the Communist Party headquarters marked the beginning of their final, desperate flight. Landing first at a military base, the pilot, aware the regime had fallen, refused to continue. The couple commandeered a car, hoping to find protection from loyal troops, but their support had evaporated. As the revolution gained momentum, former allies quickly distanced themselves. Near Târgoviște, their car broke down, and locals, recognizing the fugitives, detained them and alerted the authorities. Held at a military barracks, the Ceaușescus remained defiant, refusing to accept the reality of their downfall. Nicolae insisted he was still president. Elena lashed out at guards, but the new leadership, fearing unrest or a rescue attempt, moved swiftly. On December 25, 1989, a military tribunal charged them with crimes including genocide and abuse of power. The trial lasted less than an hour. Found guilty, they were sentenced to death. In the courtyard behind the barracks, the Ceaușescus faced a firing squad. Refusing blindfolds, Nicolae began singing the Internationale before gunfire cut him off. Their deaths were filmed and broadcast, confirming the end of their rule. Their execution marked the collapse of a brutal dictatorship. Romania, though facing an uncertain future, had reclaimed its voice. The revolution had succeeded, and the country could finally begin to heal. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.